As Malik drove through the dimly lit streets of the quiet neighborhood, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It had been a long day filled with meetings and paperwork, and he just wanted to get home. But as he turned onto a side street, two police cruisers suddenly appeared from nowhere, their lights flashing aggressively in his rearview mirror. He sighed and pulled over to the curb, with a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He had dealt with enough traffic stops in his life to know this wasn't going to be a routine one. The first officer approached his car with a stern look, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. The second officer lingered by the passenger side, peering into the vehicle with suspicion. They both seemed to radiate a level of hostility that set Malik on edge. They had stopped him on the pretense of a routine check, and for a moment Malik hoped it would end quickly. He rolled down the window and greeted the officer politely. "Evening, sir," Malik said, trying to remain calm though his gut told him otherwise. "Evening," the officer replied, his eyes scanning Malik's face with an uncomfortable intensity. "Can you step out of the vehicle, please?" Malik hesitated, his heart rate quickened, but he knew refusing wouldn't end well. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, the officer's gaze never leaving him. The second officer started walking around the car, inspecting it as if looking for something they could use against him. "Is there a problem, officer?" Malik asked, maintaining his composure despite the unease rising in his chest. "You fit the description of someone we've been looking for," the officer said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "We've had reports of a robbery in the area, and your vehicle matches the description of the getaway car." Malik frowned and glanced at his car. It was a black sedan, a fairly common model in the city. He couldn't see how it could match any specific suspect vehicle, but he kept his thoughts to himself, as he had no desire to escalate the situation. "I assure you I'm not involved in any robbery," Malik replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just heading home from work. I can show you my ID if you'd like." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked Malik up and down as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Then, without warning, he motioned to the second officer, who was already leaning against the car and looking through the windows. "We're going to need to search your vehicle," the officer said, his words final and dismissive. Malik's stomach twisted into a knot. He knew he had no legal obligation to comply with a search without cause, but he also knew arguing could lead to even more trouble, especially given the officer's aggressive tone. He looked over at the second officer, who was now pulling on gloves, his eyes gleaming with a mix of suspicion and something else, something more menacing. "Look, I don't have anything to hide," Malik said, raising his hands in a show of compliance, "but I don't see why a search is necessary." The officer's response was cold and clipped. "It's necessary because we said so. Step aside," he barked. Malik reluctantly moved away from the car as the officers began their search, unaware that this seemingly routine encounter was about to change the course of his entire life. As the officers rummaged through the contents of Malik's car, he stood off to the side, trying to maintain a sense of calm, but his mind was racing. He couldn't understand why they were treating him like this. There was no reason for the search. He had already offered to show his ID and explain his situation, but they ignored him, their focus now solely on the car. He watched them dig through his glove compartment and under the seats, their eyes scanning for anything that might give them a reason to escalate things further. The officer closest to him glanced over his shoulder and sneered as if Malik were an inconvenience. "You know we're doing this for your own safety, right?" the officer said, though his words felt hollow, like he was simply trying to justify his actions. Malik tried to keep his face neutral as he fought the urge to argue. "I understand," he replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this wasn't right. The officer's behavior was too aggressive, too focused on finding something they could use against him. The second officer suddenly grunted as he pulled something out from beneath the driver's seat. Malik's stomach lurched when he saw it. It was a briefcase, a large black leather one that he had kept hidden under the seat for safety reasons. It was the money he had worked hard for over the years, saved up for a future. He had been planning to invest in his business, but now it was in the hands of these officers. The first officer's eyes widened as he approached the second officer, who was holding the briefcase. "What's this?" he asked, his voice suddenly taking on an eager tone. The second officer opened it, slowly revealing stacks of cash neatly organized inside. Malik's heart pounded as the officers exchanged knowing glances. They looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and greed, as if they had just struck gold. "That's my money," Malik said, quickly trying to keep his voice steady. "It's for my business. I've been saving up for months now. It's not stolen or anything like you think." But the officers weren't listening. Their faces had already shifted from suspicion to something darker, something more dangerous. They were no longer interested in talking to him. They were just interested in the money. You know it's pretty convenient that you're carrying around this much cash, the first officer said with a smirk, his eyes narrowing. Looks like we've got a bit of a problem here. Malik's pulse quickened. He could feel the shift in the air. They weren't just questioning him anymore, they were making their own assumptions, and worse, they were taking advantage of the situation to line their own pockets. I told you it's my money, Malik repeated, trying to stay calm, but fear began to creep into his voice. Please, I'm just trying to get home. This isn't what it looks like. The second officer glanced down at the briefcase, then back at Malik before his lips curled into a twisted grin. Well, now it. Pay for this little misunderstanding, the officer said, his voice low and threatening as he held the briefcase in one hand, his fingers lightly tapping on its surface. We can make your life a lot harder if you don't cooperate. Malik's mind raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew he had to be careful not to provoke them further. These officers were already acting beyond the bounds of the law, and pushing back too hard could escalate things in ways he couldn't control. Please, I'm telling you this is all my money, Malik said, trying to maintain his composure, though his voice was now tinged with a hint of urgency. I've worked hard for it, and I need it for my business. It's not illegal. The first officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a look with the second officer, who was now grinning from ear to ear. They were clearly enjoying the power they had over Malik at this moment, and the way they were toying with him made his blood run cold. The second officer took a step forward. You know we don't have to do things by the book, right? He said as he shoved the briefcase deeper under his arm. We could make this all go away if you just give us a little something for our trouble. His tone was low and laced with a mix of arrogance and malice. Malik's stomach churned as the realization hit him. They weren't just going to steal his money, they were going to blackmail him. They wanted him to pay them off, to make the whole thing disappear. And if he didn't comply, they would make sure he paid in other ways too. I don't have anything to give you, Malik said, his voice finally losing its calm edge, but he didn't back down. This is a setup. You're stealing from me right now, and I won't let you get away with it. The first officer laughed darkly. You think you have the power to stop us, he said mockingly. You're just some guy who got unlucky tonight. We could make your life a lot more difficult, and nobody would ever believe you. Malik's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he knew that he had to think carefully about his next move. These officers were corrupt, but they were also dangerous, and acting recklessly could make things worse. I'm not going to let you get away with this, Malik said with newfound determination. His voice was firm, but controlled. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to back down, no matter how badly they wanted to intimidate him. The officers exchanged confused glances for a brief moment, and in that second Malik saw the opportunity he needed. With a deep breath, he pulled himself together and stood tall. He had to expose them for what they were. He couldn't let them continue their corruption unchecked. Let's go back to the station, Malik said, his tone sharp and commanding. I'm reporting this to internal affairs, and if you think you can get away with stealing from me, then you'll find out just how wrong you are. For a split second, there was silence. Then the second officer laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. The officer's grip on the briefcase tightened as he shot Malik a look of disbelief. You don't know who you're messing with, he growled as the first officer stepped closer to Malik's side. Malik could feel the tension in the air. The officers were no longer just trying to intimidate him, they were now assessing whether he truly understood the gravity of the situation. But Malik's resolve didn't waver. He stood his ground, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next steps. His plan had always been to expose corruption within the force, but he hadn't imagined his first day on the job would be so chaotic so quickly. The first officer stepped forward, his chest puffed out with arrogance. You think you can walk into this department and start throwing your weight around just because you've got a badge now? He sneered, his eyes flicking to Malik's own badge hidden under his jacket. You don't belong here. Malik's jaw clenched at the officer's words. He didn't need to hear this kind of rhetoric, not now. Not when he was already facing an uphill battle. But what they didn't realize was that Malik wasn't just a man on the street anymore. He wasn't just another black man being wrongfully accused by racist cops. He was the new chief of police, and this was his department now. As the second officer moved toward him to get in his face, Malik instinctively took a step back, but it was less out of fear and more to create space between them. He needed time to think. He needed to turn the tables on them, and he knew that if he didn't act soon, they would find a way to make this situation worse. The second officer was practically foaming at the mouth. His earlier cocky attitude had shifted to pure hostility. You think you can just waltz in here and change everything, he spat. We've been doing this for years. No one cares about you or your badge. Malik's heart raced, but his mind was clearer than ever. He realized now that his role as chief wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't just about overseeing the department. It was about rooting out the corruption that had taken root within it. The officers in front of him were a clear indication that his job wasn't going to be easy, but he had no choice but to move forward. Taking a deep breath, Malik straightened his posture and made sure his voice was firm and authoritative. "I am the new chief of police and you are under investigation for theft and misconduct," he said, his words cutting through the officer's bluster like a knife. For a moment, the officers froze, their faces went pale, their eyes darting to each other, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing, but Malik's calm demeanor left them with no room to argue, no room to pretend that this was just another easy target for their exploitation. The first officer stammered, trying to recover from the shock. "You're the chief," he repeated, his voice now tinged with disbelief. "You're the new chief." Malik nodded slowly, his eyes locked onto theirs as he let the weight of his words sink in. "That's right," he said, his voice low and commanding, "and I will make sure you face the consequences of your actions." The second officer glanced nervously around as if expecting backup to arrive, but Malik had already thought ahead. He knew the department would be watching this moment, and he had a plan for how to deal with these officers who had clearly believed they were untouchable. "Give me the money," Malik said, his tone hardening as he gestured to the briefcase that the second officer was still clutching. Malik didn't flinch as the officer reluctantly handed it over. The briefcase now felt heavier than it had ever felt before, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Malik knew that this was just the beginning. He had to ensure that these officers were held accountable, but he also knew that his actions tonight would set the tone for the rest of his tenure as chief. They had underestimated him, and now they would have to face the consequences. Malik could feel the power shift in the air as the second officer reluctantly handed him the briefcase. The officer's smug expressions had faded, replaced with uncertainty and fear. It was clear now that they were realizing the gravity of the situation. They were no longer the ones in control. They had just robbed a man who was about to become their superior, and they had no idea how much trouble they were in. The first officer stepped back, his hand instinctively going for his radio, but Malik was already several steps ahead. He could see the fear in the officer's eyes and knew they would try to cover their tracks, but he wasn't going to let that happen. This was the moment everything changed for these officers. They had crossed a line they could never undo, and now Malik was in charge. "You're going to take me to the precinct," Malik said, his voice unwavering, "and I'm going to make sure your actions are properly documented and reported." The officer stood frozen for a moment, not knowing how to respond. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the first officer, who was still staring at Malik with wide eyes. It was as if they couldn't believe what was happening, their faces contorted with disbelief at the idea that the man they were trying to intimidate was now their boss. "You can't do this," the first officer finally stammered, his voice shaky. "You don't have the authority," but the words came out weak, as if he were trying to convince himself more than Malik. Malik shook his head slowly. "I'm the new chief of police," he repeated, "and this is my department now, not yours, and you're going to follow my orders." The second officer's hand twitched at his side as if he were about to reach for his weapon, but Malik noticed and immediately stepped forward. He made sure to stand tall, making himself as intimidating as possible. Without a hint of aggression, his presence was commanding and left no room for resistance. The officers had already lost this fight before it even started. "This isn't how it works anymore," Malik continued, his voice calm but full of authority. "You've been caught stealing from me, and that's not something you'll be able to talk your way out of, no matter what you try to do." The officers exchanged nervous glances, but they knew deep down there was nothing they could say to get out of this. Their corrupt actions had been exposed, and Malik wasn't going to let them slip away unnoticed. Without a word, Malik turned toward his car. The officers followed reluctantly, as if they had no choice but to comply. They knew their chances of getting away with this had evaporated, and the reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. As Malik opened the door to his car and slid into the driver's seat, he felt the weight of the briefcase beside him. The money that had been stolen from him was now in his possession. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about setting the tone for his leadership and making it clear that corruption would no longer be tolerated in his department. "Get in," Malik said without looking at the officers who were still standing outside the car, unsure of how to proceed. They climbed into the backseat silently, the reality of their defeat hanging heavily in the air. As Malik drove them toward the precinct, he knew this would be a defining moment, not just for the officers in the back, but for the entire department, a moment that would set the foundation for the kind of leader he intended to be. As Malik drove through the dim streets toward the precinct, the silence in the car was suffocating. The two officers sat in the backseat, stiff and uncomfortable, unable to meet his gaze. Malik could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them and on him. They were no longer the confident officers they had been when they first pulled him over. Now, they They were trapped in a moment they couldn't escape from. Malik's mind raced as he considered what to do next. The power had shifted in his favor, but he knew this was only the beginning. He was about to make his first real move as the new chief of police. The officers' earlier bravado had disappeared. Their nervous glances and tense postures made it clear that they were no longer in control. They had underestimated Malik, and now they were paying the price. He couldn't help but think about how often this type of situation must have happened before. How many people had been taken advantage of by these same officers? How many had been harassed or had their belongings stolen and never spoken up? How many had been too afraid to fight back? But Malik was different. He wasn't just going to let them get away with it. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching the eyes of the second officer who was staring at him with a mix of fear and defiance. But Malik saw through it. The officer's bravado was gone, his facade shattered by the reality of who Malik truly was and the power he now wielded. "You should have thought about the consequences before you took that money," Malik said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The first officer spoke up, his voice a little less confident now. "We didn't know who you were," he muttered. "We thought you were just some guy with money. We didn't know you were the new chief." Malik didn't respond right away. He was focused on driving, but inside his mind was already working through what he would do. Once they arrived at the precinct, he had to make sure they understood the full extent of their actions, but he also had to be strategic. This couldn't be a knee-jerk reaction. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. His first day on the job had already been chaotic enough, and now he had to ensure that everything went according to plan. When they arrived at the precinct, Malik parked the car in a secluded area behind the building. He turned off the engine and turned to face the officers, who were now visibly sweating. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They were no longer the powerful figures they had been when they pulled him over. Now, they were just two corrupt officers caught in a web of their own making. "You're going to tell me everything," Malik said, his tone cold and commanding. "I want a full confession, and I want it now." The second officer opened his mouth as if to protest, but Malik cut him off with a single look. The officer immediately fell silent. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Malik continued. "That money you stole isn't just going to disappear, and neither will your actions. I will make sure everyone in this department knows exactly what you've done." The first officer looked like he was about to speak again, but his words faltered, his defiance gone completely. Malik could see that they were starting to crack under the pressure. They were realizing just how deep they had dug themselves into a hole. "You're going to face the consequences for your actions," Malik said again, his voice low and steady, "and I will make sure you don't get away with it." He paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air like a heavy weight before adding, "This is just the beginning, but trust me when I say it won't end well for either of you." The officers sat there silent, unable to deny the truth of what Malik was saying. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to pay for it. The question was how far Malik would go to ensure they faced the full extent of the law. Malik sat in the car for a moment, letting the silence settle around them. The officers were no longer the cocky figures they had been when they first stopped him. They were deflated now, their earlier bravado completely gone. Malik could see the fear in their eyes, but he wasn't ready to show them any mercy. Not yet. They had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. And as the new chief of police, he had to make it clear that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated anymore. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. This was his moment to set the tone for the department, to show that change was coming, and he wasn't going to let the corruption continue without consequences. Without a word, Malik stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance of the precinct. He could feel the officers following behind him, their footsteps hesitant and slow. He didn't need to look back to know they were nervous. But he wasn't interested in comforting them. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about setting things right and ensuring that justice would prevail for all the people who had been hurt by officers like them. Once inside the precinct, Malik headed straight for the office of the Internal Affairs Division. He had no time to waste. He needed to report everything immediately. He couldn't afford for these officers to have any chance of slipping away or covering their tracks, not when they were so deep in their corruption. As he walked through the halls, he could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, but none dared to speak. As Malik passed by them, he knew word of what had happened tonight would spread like wildfire through the department, but that was fine with him. He wanted everyone to know that this was the new reality under his leadership. When they reached the Internal Affairs office, Malik didn't hesitate. He walked straight in without knocking. The officers in the room looked up in surprise, but Malik didn't care about their reaction. He was here to make a statement, and he wasn't going to waste time with pleasantries. "I need to report misconduct and theft," Malik said, his voice steady and firm as he placed the briefcase on the desk for everyone to see. "These two officers have stolen from me, and I have the evidence to prove it." The room went silent. The officers in internal affairs exchanged quick glances before one of them stood up. "Chief Malik," he said, his voice respectful but cautious, "what's going on here?" Malik took a deep breath before speaking again. "I'm the new chief of police, and these two officers tried to rob me tonight. They pulled me over and searched my car under false pretenses and stole a large sum of money I've been saving for my business. They thought I was just another target, but they didn't know who they were dealing with." The two officers who had followed him into the room were standing off to the side, their faces pale, their mouths shut tight. They knew the game was up. There was no way out now. Malik had put them in a corner, and there was nowhere for them to go. "Do you have any proof?" one of the internal affairs officers asked cautiously, his eyes flicking to the briefcase on the desk. Malik didn't hesitate. He opened the briefcase, revealing the stacks of cash inside. "Here's your proof," he said, his voice cold and resolute. "They took this money and they're going to be held accountable for it." The internal affairs officers looked at each other in silence for a moment before one of them spoke again. "Chief Malik, we're going to need you to make an official report, and then we'll take over from here." Malik nodded slowly. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make sure these officers are held accountable," he said, his eyes never leaving the two men who had stolen from him. "And I want this to be a lesson for everyone in this department that corruption has no place here anymore." He could see the wheels turning in the officers' minds. They were processing everything they had just heard, and Malik knew that this was the beginning of something bigger. This was his first step toward cleaning up the department and making it a place where integrity mattered more than power or greed. The internal affairs officers began to move quickly. Now they took the briefcase from Malik's hands and began to examine the cash carefully. One officer immediately began writing notes, while the other picked up the phone and made a call to higher-ups in the department. Malik watched them work with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. He could see the officers who had stolen from him shrinking back further into the background, their earlier arrogance completely wiped away. They were nothing now, just two men caught in a lie that would end their careers. Malik could feel the sense of power shift entirely in his favor, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax just a little. One of the officers in internal affairs looked at Malik after a few moments and said, "We've already called for backup, and the department's going to want a full statement from you. We need everything you know about what happened tonight and any prior interactions with these officers, if there are any." Malik nodded his head and began to gather his thoughts. He knew what he had to do now. He had to lay everything out, make sure that there were no loose ends to tie up, that everything was documented and clear so there would be no question about how the investigation would proceed. He couldn't afford for this to be anything less than airtight, because if these officers were allowed to slip through the cracks, it would set a terrible precedent for the entire department. "Before we go any further," Malik said, his voice steady as he addressed the two officers, who were now sitting quietly at the side of the room, "I want to make something very clear." He looked at them directly. Their eyes were lowered, and it was clear they didn't know how to respond to being confronted with their own actions. "You've betrayed the trust of this department and every person in this city who relies on us to protect them." His tone was sharp and unforgiving. "You thought you could get away with this because you had the power and the badge, but the truth is you're nothing more than thieves in uniform." The first officer flinched at Malik's words but said nothing. The second officer shifted nervously in his seat. He seemed to be trying to hold himself together, but it was obvious that Malik's words had gotten under his skin. They were both now realizing just how much trouble they were in, and the reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. Malik turned back to the internal affairs officers. "I want them both taken into custody immediately. I want their actions fully investigated, and I want them removed from the force once and for all." The internal affairs officer who had been taking notes nodded. "We'll take care of it, Chief. You've done the right thing bringing this to us." Malik stood up and walked toward the door. He didn't look back at the two officers who were still sitting in the corner of the room waiting for their fate to be sealed. But as he reached the door, he paused for a moment and looked at the officers in internal affairs. "Make sure everyone knows what happened tonight," he said, his voice firm. "This is a message for everyone in the department that corruption will no longer be tolerated, and anyone who thinks they can abuse their power will be held accountable." As Malik left the room, he felt a sense of weight lifted from his shoulders. The first battle had been won, but he knew this was just the beginning. There was so much more to be done to truly clean up the department, but this was a start, and Malik felt confident that the message he had sent tonight would resonate across the precinct. His leadership was now cemented, and there was no turning back. Malik stepped out of the Internal Affairs office, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him. As the door clicked shut behind him, he glanced around the precinct and noticed a few officers lingering in the hallways, their eyes following him, but none of them dared to approach or speak to him. They all knew what had transpired in the Internal Affairs room, and it was clear that word was already spreading. The tension in the air was palpable. Malik's actions had made a clear statement, and the ripple effect would be felt throughout the entire department. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. It wasn't lost on him that the precinct had felt different. Now there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to change. Malik wasn't sure what to expect next, but he knew that this moment would set the tone for everything that followed. The corrupt officers had been exposed, but that was just one part of the larger picture. There were still many more officers who would have to be held accountable for their actions, and Malik wasn't going to rest until he had cleaned up every corner of the department. As Malik entered his new office, he couldn't help but pause for a moment, taking in the sight of his surroundings. The office was still bare. There were no personal items on the desk, no family photos, no reminders of the life he had left behind. It was just him in this new position of power and responsibility, and for a moment he allowed himself to reflect on how far he had come. He wasn't just the new chief of police, he was a man who had worked his entire life to get to this point, to stand up for what was right in a system that had been broken for far too long. The fight he had just started was about so much more than a briefcase full of stolen cash. It was about reshaping an institution that had allowed corruption to fester for years. It was about proving to the community that he would fight for them, that he wouldn't back down when the stakes were high. Malik sat behind the desk and began to sort through the paperwork left for him. There were reports and files, some dating back years, that would need his attention, but right now his mind kept returning to the two officers he had confronted just hours ago. He had exposed their corruption and taken the first step toward removing them from the department, but that was only part of the battle. They weren't the only officers who needed to be held accountable. There were others in the department who had likely been involved in similar activities, and Malik knew he would need to root them out one by one. His phone buzzed on the desk, and Malik quickly picked it up. It was an internal call from one of his senior officers. "Chief Malik," the voice on the other end said, "We just received reports that there's been a shift in morale among the rank and file. Some of the officers are already questioning what's happening here, and we've had a few come forward with concerns about your leadership." Malik leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. This was exactly what he had anticipated. There would be resistance. There would always be those who resisted change. But he couldn't let that deter him. He had already proven his commitment to doing what was right, and now he needed to follow through no matter how difficult it became. "I expect full cooperation from everyone in this department," Malik said, his voice steady but firm. "We're moving forward with changes, and if anyone has a problem with that, then they can leave. I'm not here to appease anyone. I'm here to make this department better, and I will make sure every officer understands that." He ended the call and stared out the window of his office, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He knew that tonight had been a victory, but it was just the beginning. He had many more battles to face, but Malik was ready for whatever came next. The hard work of rebuilding the department had only just begun, and he wasn't about to let up now. The next few days passed in a blur for Malik. There was an overwhelming amount of work to be done, and he dove into it without hesitation. Every file needed to be reviewed, every officer had to be evaluated, and Malik knew that the resistance from within the department wasn't going to vanish overnight. Whispers of his actions were circulating through the precinct, and while some officers were beginning to warm up to the idea of change, others were digging in their heels, refusing to accept that the department would ever be the same again. Malik had made enemies with his bold moves, but he had also made allies, those who recognized that the corruption had gone on for too long, and finally someone was stepping up to stop it. Malik's office had become a revolving door for both supporters and critics. Officers came in and out seeking clarity, some to voice their concerns, others to ask for guidance. But Malik wasn't bothered by it. He had expected this kind of tension. He had known from the beginning that his leadership wouldn't be embraced by everyone, and that it would take time for the department to adjust. But Malik wasn't the kind of man who backed down from a challenge. He had a job to do, and he was determined to see it through no matter how difficult it became. One morning, Malik sat at his desk, sifting through the list of officers who had been implicated in various forms of misconduct. There were names he recognized and others he didn't, but what was clear was that there was a systemic issue within the department, and it wasn't going to be solved overnight. He knew that exposing the two officers who had stolen from him was only the tip of the iceberg, and the real work was still ahead. He had to address the culture of corruption and ensure that anyone involved was held accountable. A knock on the door broke Malik's thoughts, and he looked up to see one of the senior officers standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, but his posture tense. "Chief Malik, we need to talk," the officer said. Malik gestured for him to come in, and the officer stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The officer stood for a moment before speaking again. "There's been a lot of talk among the rank and file since the arrests. The other officers are worried about what's going to happen next. They're scared of losing their jobs and their pensions. There's a lot of uncertainty." Malik took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. He knew this moment was coming. The department wasn't just worried about the immediate consequences of the arrests, they were concerned about the ripple effect that would follow. Those who had been involved in smaller infractions were now terrified that their actions would be scrutinized too, and Malik understood that fear, but he also knew that it was necessary to create a clear line between those who were committed to the work and those who were just protecting their own interests. "Tell them they have nothing to worry about if they've done their jobs with integrity," Malik said, his voice calm and steady. "Anyone who has been operating within the law and upholding the principles of this department has nothing to fear, but those who have been breaking the rules will be dealt with swiftly and justly." The officer nodded slowly as if weighing Malik's words. "I'll pass that along, but you need to be careful, Chief. There's a lot of distrust right now, and some people are already talking about pushing back." Malik leaned forward, his gaze firm. "Let them talk," he said. "I'm not backing down, and neither should they. If they're truly committed to doing the right thing, then they have no reason to fear change." The officer gave a slight nod and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're doing the right thing, Chief," he said quietly before walking out of the office. Malik sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. The department was going to change, and no amount of resistance would stop it. The corruption that had played the force for so long was being uprooted one step at a time, and Malik was determined to see it through until the very end. The days following the meeting with the senior officer were filled with tension and uncertainty, but Malik kept his focus on the task at hand. He knew the department was divided and that some officers were still questioning his leadership, but he wasn't about to let that distract him. The work was too important, and the stakes were too high. Malik's strategy was simple: expose the truth, hold those accountable who had abused their power, and create an environment where integrity was rewarded, not fear. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. Malik's first order of business was to set up a series of meetings with officers across the department. He wanted to hear their concerns and understand where the resistance was coming from. He knew that change wouldn't happen if he didn't have the support of at least some of the rank and file officers, but he also knew that he couldn't compromise on his values. He wasn't there to make friends, he was there to make the department better, and if that meant stepping on some toes, so be it. The first meeting was with a group of patrol officers who had been with the department for years. They were experienced and had seen it all, but they were also deeply entrenched in the old ways. Malik could see the skepticism in their eyes as they sat across from him in the small conference room, their arms crossed, their faces hard, their posture defensive. "I know there's a lot of fear and confusion right now," Malik began, his voice steady and calm. "But I want to be clear, I'm not here to tear this department apart. I'm here to fix it. I'm here to restore the integrity we've lost and make sure that the people we serve can trust us again." One of the officers scoffed. "Integrity," he muttered. "It's easy for you to say that, but things don't change overnight. We've been doing things the same way for years. You can't just come in and expect everyone to fall in line." Malik met his gaze without flinching. "I understand it's not easy," he said. "But I'm not asking for everyone to fall in line. I'm asking for you to do what's right. I'm asking you to be a part of the solution, not the problem. If you're not willing to change, then this isn't the place for you." The room went silent for a moment, and Malik could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. The officer who had spoken was still glaring at him, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Malik wasn't sure if it was doubt about Malik's leadership or doubt about his own actions over the years, but it was there, and Malik knew it was a crack in the wall. "I've seen what this department is capable of when we work together," Malik continued. "I've seen the good that we can do for this city, and I believe we can get back to that if we hold ourselves accountable and work as a team." Another officer spoke up this time, her voice softer than before. "What happens if we don't want to change, if we don't agree with you?" Malik didn't hesitate. "Then you'll have to face the consequences," he said firmly. "This is about more than just one person's agenda. This is about making sure the department serves the people who rely on us to protect them. If you're not willing to do that, then you're not part of the team and there's no place for you here." The officers sat in silence once again, some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others staring at the table or out the window, but Malik could tell that the conversation had made an impact. They weren't all convinced, but he had planted a seed of doubt in their minds, and that was all he needed. As the meeting ended, Malik walked out of the room and down the hallway, his mind racing with the weight of the conversation. He had just had the resistance wasn't going to disappear overnight, but he was making progress one officer at a time, and that was enough for now. He would continue to fight for what he knew was right, and he would make sure that anyone who couldn't accept that would have to answer for it. A few weeks passed since that crucial meeting, and Malik could feel the department shifting, but it was a slow process. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but Malik remained steadfast in his mission. The changes weren't easy, and the resistance was strong, but with each passing day he saw the seeds of reform beginning to take root. Some officers were starting to come around, while others were still clinging to the old ways, but Malik wasn't discouraged. The work was too important to give up on now. One morning, Malik received an unexpected visit from one of his trusted officers, Sergeant Harper. Harper had been with the department for over 20 years and had seen everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Harper had always been a steady presence in the precinct, someone the other officers looked up to, someone whose word carried weight. Malik knew that if he could get Harper on his side, the rest of the department would follow. Harper had the respect of the rank and file, and his endorsement would be a game changer. "Chief Malik," Harper began as he walked into Malik's office, his voice serious but calm, "I need to talk to you about something." Malik looked up from his desk and gestured for Harper to sit. He could tell by the look on the sergeant's face that this was important. "What's on your mind?" Malik asked. Harper sat down and leaned forward. "I've been watching what you're doing here. I've seen the changes you're trying to make, and I have to say I'm impressed." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Impressed?" he repeated. "I wasn't expecting that from you." Harper chuckled softly. "Well, I didn't think I'd be saying it either, but I can see the writing on the wall. This department needs change. We've been stuck in our ways for too long, and it's time for something different." Malik sat up straighter. He could feel the weight of what Harper was saying. This wasn't just a passing compliment. This was a shift in perspective. Harper had always been a man of principle, and if he was on board with the changes, Malik knew they were gaining traction. "So you're with me?" Malik said, his voice steady but full of anticipation. Harper nodded. "I'm with you," he said firmly. "I've had my doubts like everyone else, but I've seen how you've handled things. You're not backing down, and that means something to me. You're not just talking about change, you're making it happen." Malik felt a sense of relief wash over him hearing Harper's words of support, but he knew this wasn't the end of the road. There was still much work to do. There were still officers to be held accountable and policies to be rewritten. The Harper's support was a big step forward. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate your support more than you know." Harper gave him a small smile. "I'm not doing it for you, Chief. I'm doing it for the department, for the city, for the officers who are actually trying to do their jobs right." Malik nodded. He understood completely. Harper wasn't looking for personal gain. He was in this for the greater good, and Malik knew he would need more officers like Harper if he was going to succeed in his mission. "Let's make sure we get this right then," Malik said. "Let's work together to clean up this department once and for all." Harper stood up and extended his hand to Malik, who shook it firmly. "You've got my full support, Chief," Harper said, "and I'll make sure the others know that too." As Harper left, Malik sat back in his chair, a sense of purpose filling him. For the first time in weeks, he knew the path ahead would be difficult, but with officers like Harper on his side, he felt like they could accomplish anything. The fight for justice had only just begun, but Malik was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The days grew longer and the pressure mounted, but Malik felt a renewed sense of strength now that Sergeant Harper was on his side. The shift in morale was noticeable. More officers began to step forward with their concerns, but also with their commitment to the changes that were being implemented. It wasn't perfect, and not everyone was fully on board, but there was a palpable shift in the air. The tension that had once filled the precinct with whispers and fear began to give way to an air of determination. Malik knew that they were on the right path. One afternoon, Malik was called into a meeting with the city's mayor, who had been watching the situation closely for weeks. There was a certain amount of pressure from the public, who had heard the rumors of corruption within the department, but also a growing sense of hope that things were changing. The mayor was a well-groomed politician who knew how to play both sides, but Malik could tell he was genuinely invested in the success of the department. "Chief Malik," the mayor began, "I've been hearing good things about what's happening at the precinct. I've also been hearing some concerns. How do you plan to ensure that the changes you're implementing will stick long-term?" Malik leaned forward, his eyes focused. He had been prepared for this question. He knew that the success of his reforms wasn't just about removing the bad officers. It was about building a culture of accountability and trust, one that would last far beyond his time as chief. "It's not just about removing the corrupt officers," Malik said. "It's about changing the way we operate, creating a system where integrity is the standard and where those who fail to uphold it are held accountable." not just by me but by their fellow officers. The mayor nodded slowly. And how will you handle the backlash, she asked. Malik looked the mayor in the eye. There will always be backlash. Change is never easy, but I'm not backing down. We've already seen some resistance, but I believe the officers who are committed to doing the right thing will stand by me. The rest will be weeded out over time. The mayor sat back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him as if weighing Malik's words. I'll be honest, Chief, this isn't going to be easy for anyone. The public will be watching closely, and the pressure will only increase, but I'm willing to back you if you can prove that your reforms are more than just temporary measures. Malik nodded. I'm not here for temporary measures, he said, his voice resolute. I'm here to create lasting change, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to see it through. The mayor smiled and extended his hand. Then you have my support, Chief. As Malik left the mayor's office, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be bumps along the way, but for the first time since taking the job, he felt a sense of confidence that he was on the right path. The department was changing, and he was leading that change, but he also knew that true reform wouldn't come from just removing a few bad apples. It would come from fostering a culture of transparency and accountability, one that would take time but eventually transform the department into something the community could trust again. As he walked through the precinct later that day, Malik noticed something different. The officers he passed in the halls seemed more focused, their eyes meeting his with respect instead of suspicion. There was still work to be done, but Malik knew they were on the cusp of something important. He had taken the first steps toward fixing a broken system, and now he was determined to see it through to the end, because for the first time in years, the department felt like it could be the force for good that it was meant to be, and Malik was ready to lead them there.